Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Streaming Alchemy Show. I'm John Mahoney, and on today's show, we're going to be talking about virtual PTZ cameras, effectively using the virtual PTZ capabilities baked into most production systems to work with sources that are 4K or even higher. But before we get into that, I want to remind everybody we will be taking live callers during the show. So if you want, please connect to the URL we're showing here in the lower third, or I believe it's right at the top of the show description here with the stream. So we'd love to have you on. If you have a question or want to make a comment about anything we're talking about, it would be great to have you here with us on the show. Uh, so virtual PTZs, probably the best way to look at this is to first think about what a PTZ camera actually is. A PTZ camera is typically anchored in a fixed position, but has the ability to remotely pan, move from left to right, tilt, move up and down, and zoom in or out to properly frame the subject that you want to capture for a video. So when you talk about virtual PTZ cameras, you're taking some of that and you're applying it to a fixed camera, but typically a fixed camera with a high resolution. So the easiest way to think about virtualizing a camera is to think of cutting sections out of that image that's coming back from the camera and streaming those instead of taking the entire image from that camera. And this is really what happens in a virtual PTZ setup. So for today's show, we're going to be using vMix to go through, the different sort of configurations for virtualizing cameras, as well as, looking at how these, could be applied to things beyond cameras. So if we switch over to the console here, this is a vMix setup that I have laid out that actually has a connection to right over here, a high resolution 4K camera. So the camera we're going to be using for this is a Sony A7 III, and we're using a 25 to 70 millimeter lens zoomed all the way out at 24 millimeters. So that should give you a sense of sort of the image that we're working with. So let me just show you here how I set this up so we can start from there. This input here is the input for the 4K camera we have over there. And right now, if I go in, let me just jump over here. You can see that the image we're getting, the resolution here is 3840 by 2160. So this is the resolution, UHD resolution, not quite traditional 4K, but it's the UHD resolution that's supplied by the camera. So that's the image that we have coming in. This production is actually a 1080p production. So the image that you see in here is scaled down from that UHD image into a 1080 image for the production. But all the information that's contained in that 4K image is still there. So if I wanted to leverage that, I can click on the gear icon and go to in the configuration panel for that input, the PTZ section. And while this normally would be how you'd set up a traditional PTZ camera, where you could go down and pick any of the supported cameras that they also have something here called virtual PTZ. And when you pick that, it now looks at the image of that camera as a space, an image space that it can cut a segment out of as needed. And what it lets you do is specify when you say, I want to set this up as a PTZ camera, a virtual PTZ camera, it lets you specify what's the zoom factor I want. Now, since we're dealing with a 4K camera, uh, zooming by 2, meaning going into a quarter of that screen, still preserves the 1080p level of resolution that we'd have from, in the normal production. So by putting that 2x there, it limits the camera so you never lose resolution. If you wanted to make the image softer, you could up that. This covers, zooms all the way up to 10x. So it is possible that if you're willing to sacrifice quality of the image for the flexibility of zooming into that image even further, you could set it. But for this case, we want to stick with 2x, and that gives us, no loss in quality as we create new images to work with from the original 4K. So since we have this set up, let me just connect to it. So now this camera is hooked in as a virtual PTZ. So all these controls for pan, tilt, and zoom that would normally work to mechanically move a traditional PTZ camera now move the box that I'm cutting out of the higher res image. So in this case, let me just create one, and then I can show you a bit more. If I zoom in some and just come over here, all I need to do now to create this as an input is click over here, create input at this position. And now, if you look, I have a new virtual uh, preset here for zooming in. So if I go here, uh, I can zoom in. Now let's say I want to go back to the full image. I can create another input. So all I'll do is I'll tell the camera to zoom back out, and now I create a second input. So with this now, I'm able to go between the zoomed in image here or the full image. And I can continue doing this. So let me go to something that I've already set up with some camera shots. So here I have multiple shots. I can go down and take a shot that's focused on the desk, do a wider shot and then to the full wide. So with this now, I've taken the one 4K image and I've carved it into multiple segments that I can use in my production as if they were independent camera shots. And you can see that this moves as you do it. So when I click on, moving from one position to the other, you see that zoom happen. So if you wanted to, the same way you would hide a zoom in a PTZ in a traditional PTZ by having it be in preview before you shift to a new position, you would probably want to do the same thing here, where what you're doing mechanically uh, while replaced virtually, still something that probably isn't necessarily aesthetically pretty. So you'd probably want to do something just off camera with that. So I think this gives you a sense of what you can do with sort of a traditional camera. You can carve out multiple virtual inputs on that, but there's a different use that people have for virtualizing cameras, and that's virtual sets. So if we look at a virtual set, I'll click over here. A virtual set is effectively a layered set of images where you, you, y- there's Jeffrey, hi, great to have you here. Do any of these PTZ cameras? Oh, so Jeffrey's just asking if any of them offer a servo style movement, meaning that the shot has easing in. So, Jeffrey, there are some cameras that are at the higher end which have much better mechanics. Most of the sort of consumer grade PTZ cameras that people would have actually have fairly low end mechanics. Uh, I believe that in some, like the TriCaster, I believe, you have the ability to create ease in and ease out on camera moves. And there's probably some basic level of ease in, ease out here, but controlling the whole path, setting up something where you could, say this is exactly not just the speed ease in and out, but the path that I'd want it to take through that image. I don't believe there's something readily available baked into the products that we're talking about in vMix or in the TriCaster. But that's great, because it's a general problem when you deal with PTZs is the fluidity of the movement and how much of that you'd want to do on camera based on that quality. Okay, so getting back, Jeffrey, thank you. So getting back to virtual sets, the layering of those sets happens where you have a front image, a talent image usually, that is chroma keyed. You have a green or blue screen background typically, and you cut out that green screen and just have the talent standing out on their own with sort of an alpha channel surrounding what was formerly green. So that becomes all transparent. Uh, So yes, they are. PTZs are a great. They solve a lot of issues with production, and they allow you to have more shots than you have cameras. So that's definitely a great thing. In any production, it just gives you more creative opportunities. So in getting back to the virtual sets, we have a background layer here that I'm taking and a foreground layer which is keyed out. So if I just go here to the foreground layer, you can see this is an input we set up. This is based on an image instead of a camera, but we set this up as a 4K image. Uh, and the reason we did that, and again, we did the same thing with what we're going to use for the background image. The reason we did that is because in virtual sets, you have the ability to zoom in. So what I'm effectively doing, even though they don't call it virtual PTZ, is I have a virtual PTZ in the set. So I need to be able to move in and move around that set to create some level of realism. And what would happen is if you are just using your HD camera, when you move in on that talent, you're going to end up with softening. There's sort of a lack of definition in the image. And that will become noticeable, especially if you have a higher resolution background image. That contrast between the sharpness of the background and the sharpness of what should be the object of focus, which would be the talent, will become apparent to people. Even if it's just subconsciously, their eye will be drawn to the background instead of the talent. So we want to create a virtual set using the highest resolution imagery you can use for the talent and for the background, so you preserve that. So the way I set this up, if you look, is I went in and if I go to show sort of from the beginning, if I went here, I can go and click on virtual set as an input, and there are two, one called blank and one called blank 10. So blank, which is the one we used, has a background and 4 layers on top. Blank 10 has a background and 10 layers on top. So we only had 2 layers we were going to use, so we just used blank here. And then you can see here we get to pick what we want to set in the background and what we get to set in each of the layers. So the background, we're picking the studio set, and in the layer 1, we're choosing the talent. So if I click here and switch this over, if I now want to move around in here, I can also set a whole set of presets. Again, very much in the PTZ model, which is why I really want to cover this here. So I have the ability through these presets to move around and zoom in, frame the shots differently, do all the things I could do with the physical PTZ camera, but now here inside the set. The thing that a lot of people will probably be thinking though is, do I really need to invest in 4K to do this type of to preserve this type of quality in the image? And there's a little trick I want to share for something you can actually do. If you want to preserve the image quality of the talent, you can take an HD camera and turn it sideways. This will actually narrow the width of the image that you can be using, because now you only have 1080 pixels going across. But now I have 1920 pixels going, from vertically. So when that image zooms in now, you're almost looking at something that is 4K in resolution. So you can even take the cameras that you have now for HD production work and use them in virtual sets, because you're chroma keying out everything around the talent, to create an effective UHD camera. So the difference is 1920 versus 2160. So you're only talking a very small difference. So that's a trick that can come in useful. And the reason this works is because in almost any of the production systems, you have positioning controls that allow you to rotate. So I could just take this image and put it, at a sideways angle and add that into the set. So if I turn my camera, the image would be lined up correctly and everything would look great. So this gives us the ability to, leverage lower quality gear in the highest quality way possible. So something to keep in mind as you look at setting up your, virtual sets as well. So it's a good element to have in your toolkit of things to do. Uh, the other thing though is that sometimes you're going to want to use virtual PTZs without cameras, and you'd really want to use them in around images. So probably the most realistic case I could think of this is something you would normally do with training. If you wanted to have somebody who had a product and you want to be able to jump in and start to demo what's going on with that product, you could actually take and put a very high res image in place in your system and then carve that up into individual shots. So in this case, I took a control surface for the A10 production switcher. And if I wanted to do a tutorial on this, I could now just, sort of jump around to different segments of the interface and talk specifically about, what you can and can't do, with the product. So it's a very effective way using this sort of virtualized PTZ. It's a very effective way to do training style videos. And one of the other things you get, and I just wanted to show this, is you also still have mechanical control of, virtual mechanical control of the PTZ in this case. So if I look here and I have this image, and I'll just put it going out of the system, if I wanted to move around here, oh, sorry, let me switch over here. If I wanted to move around here, I have the ability now to take and zoom in or to zoom out to any part of this image that I wanted to using a manual control. So I could have presets that were all in place initially, but still use a joystick to position specifically based on questions or feedback you may get from the audience that's viewing. So even though we are setting this up as purely virtualized shots, you still have interactive mechanical control of those shots. And you can set all of the shots up on buttons as well. So you could use, this is an X keys that I'm using. It's called an XK12 joystick. It's great for this. But you can use basically any controller. Xbox controllers are a big favorite of a lot of people that use PTZs. So that should work fine with this as well. So the last thing that I wanted to touch on for here is actually something of a marketing style use for virtual PTZ. So let me just switch to here, put this in. So if you are working with images, let's say I wanted to do something where I'm doing a show or a product introduction, you may not have video of products that people want you to talk about. But using virtual PTZ control, you can actually, if you're careful and dial things in, set things up in a visually interesting way that almost looks like you did a pan move in the After Effects and imported that as video into your production. So if you see here, I have an image here that is of the TriCaster TC1. This is a fairly high resolution image, at least 4K. So I can, just like before when we talked about training, I can zoom in and do things with this as sort of an interactive basis. But I can also, since I line this up, I could actually, let me just show you this, I could actually do a smooth pan across the control surface as a video image. So if I wanted to inject this into my production as sort of a beauty shot of the product, you could take images that were coming from people last minute, put them in, and set this kind of move up as a virtual PTZ move, and create what is a very effective shot for highlighting the product image that you have, but in a way that's much more interesting to just a static image that you have up on a wall and start talking about it. So that's really everything I wanted to cover here with virtual PTZs. It's useful in a lot of different situations. There are different ways that you can work with images in it. And just as a tidbit, one of the great ways to get images for this type of work is the press kits that a lot of product companies have. So you can go down and they have very high resolution images designed for media and the press that will let you get this type of resolution that you can pan and zoom through. So very, very effective way if you want to add those to your shows. So I hope everybody found this useful. I'm always grateful for people joining and watching us live. If you're watching this on the replay, again, thank you for taking the time to, spend once a week with us on a geeky subject in the video production space. But I really love doing this, and I love having all of you along for the ride with me. So on next week's show, we want to talk about some production software utilities that everybody that's doing live streaming should know about and probably have in your toolkit at the ready when the need arises. So thank you all. And until next week, take care.